And one of the things that I think is super commendable about Stack Overflow is the level of transparency employees have, into the business and its goals and its targets and its results. I do think one nice thing, if you're able to educate yourself in the world of computer science and software development, is you can always say, well, I might lose this job, but, there's always more demand than supply when it comes to talented engineers. And so, I'll find my way to something next. I think that is a really interesting strategy to approach for a company to embrace open source and to encourage their, developers or engineers to work in that so that they can, in that way, reach a really broad community of folks who might be interested in working at that company and show their technical acumen.
Hey everyone, this is Sean Paul here, and I'm super excited about this episode with Ben Popper from Stack Overflow. The background on today's episode is that both Ben and I have worked for startups as well as in big tech. And we have lots of friends and former colleagues that have struggled with navigating and thinking through the transition from big tech to startups, in particular for engineering roles. Startups can be a ton of fun, also sometimes very stressful. And it's ultimately a very different experience in a lot of ways than working at, a company like Google or Meta or Apple and so on. And if you don't know anything about startups, it can be difficult to evaluate a company at an early stage. It's difficult to evaluate maybe the offer that they're making if you don't know anything about options and what that all may mean for your career. So Ben and I share our thoughts and experience on these and more. Hopefully you enjoy the show. Please remember to subscribe and hit me up on email or Twitter if you have any questions or suggestions for the show. All right, now let's get to the interview. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sean, long time no see. I think you and I might have been recording a podcast earlier on my side of the house. So it's great to talk twice in one day.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it brightens my Friday, to say the least. Yeah, so thanks so much for being here. So I want to talk about startups and engineering, but maybe before we dive too deep into the weeds here, you can introduce yourself. So who are you?
Oh, sure.
What do you do? And how did you get to where you are?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Ben Popper, and at the moment, I'm the Senior Director of Content at Stack Overflow, where I've been for 5 years. And so at Stack Overflow, my job is working on the blog and the podcast and the newsletter, making sure it's full of stuff that's interesting to a wide range of developers and technologists. I came from a journalist background, so I did maybe 10 years covering startups and tech companies. I worked at The Verge for 5 of those years. And when I was working at The Verge, I became the drone beat reporter. We all had to pick a gadget. I picked consumer drones, and they kind of blew up between 2013 and 2020. They went from something that was relatively obscure to something a lot of people knew about. And so around the middle, I think, of 2018, I decided to make a change and move from journalism to working inside a tech company. So I joined DJI, which is the world's biggest manufacturer of consumer drones. I spent a lot of time in Shenzhen in China, traveling back and forth. I got to do product launches and videos with them about the way people are using drones around the world. And then ironically, I said, what I really miss is having a great office and culture with people, because that wasn't something DJI really had. And so I found this job at Stack Overflow, which had an amazing office in New York City. We used to have lunch together every day. It was sit with the engineers, sit with the salespeople. Sadly, the pandemic changed all that. I now live about 2.5 hours outside New York City, but that's how I found myself at Stack, and I've been sitting at the intersection for a long time of, business and technology, and more recently diving more fully into software development as my focus.
That's one of the reasons I was really interested in having this conversation with you, because I think that you have sort of a unique perspective as somebody who's been worked as a tech journalist. You've seen a lot of, companies. You've probably talked to lots of different people and kind of taking almost an investigative approach to it. So you're a little bit outside of it, but not completely divorced from it. So you've probably have a good sense for, what makes for a successful company to some degree. And of course, with your experience at Stack Overflow, I'm sure over the past 5 years, you've seen tremendous amount of growth and change that's happened there as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we're coming to the beginning of a new era for startups. It was hard for me to realize it when I came fresh out of, school in 2010 to start covering stuff, that we were living in this, ZERP economy of zero interest rates. I didn't understand then that the way startups were getting money and the way they were getting valuations and the way big tech companies were able to, borrow and acquire was wasn't normal. Wasn't, to me, it was like, this is my introduction to technology and business. I'm writing about it. I'm learning it. I didn't have that perspective that, things aren't always this way. And so the pandemic in some ways even maybe amplified those trends, made some of those excesses go even higher. And then more recently, I think the pendulum has finally swung the other way where, companies from big and small are increasingly focused on the bottom line, on profitability. And that has led to a lot of pain in the tech industry, a lot of layoffs at big companies, a lot of down rounds at startups, and a lot of uncertainty about whether or not, this new normal is going to last.
Yeah. And I think because of the big change, and we've even seen like major, layoffs from major companies, like Google that is known, like basically they never lay people off. Like you don't get fired from Google.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really, I think, changed the industry, and it's changed, I think, an engineering perspective on, where am I safe or what kind of job do I want? And
Totally.
a lot of people are moving from, maybe the comfort of big tech or a career in big tech. And now they're faced with like, do I go to a startup? So that's kind of, I think what I was interested in trying to explore, because I think there's a lot of people that are in that space. Even my, former manager at Google, he's in that spot today. He spent over a decade at Google, and then now he's thinking like, do I start my own company? Or what does that mean? And do I go join a startup? And what does that mean? So in my own experience, I've been a founder. So I've seen like the really early stages of a company, and I've also, as I mentioned, worked for Google. And now I work for Series B startups. So I've seen quite a few different life stages personally for a company and an engineering organization. And there's definitely big differences between those experiences. And from your sort of years of working in the space, like how is, in your opinion, like engineering or working at a startup kind of different than working at like a big tech company?
Yeah. So, I've worked at 3 companies that I guess, when I was there, you could have technically still described them as startups in that like they hadn't gone public and they'd raised some venture capital, right? So I started working at Vox Media, and, it was in growth phase. At a point in time when I got there, they raised money and declared themselves a unicorn, which was that was the fashionable thing to do. You had to be on the unicorn list to hire the best talent. And I think, one of the things that's nice about working at a place early on, I joined The Verge, 6 months, I think, after it's founded. So not founding team, but pretty early on, is that, there's a lot of greenfield. Not every department has been created, there's not maybe, the same level of middle management or hierarchy that you find at a big company. And so, if you're ambitious, or, if you have an idea, it's easier to get that in play, to see it tested. And if it works, I think to profit from that, maybe not profit directly in a monetary sense, but, expand the scope of what you're working on, get a promotion, become a manager, or take on new initiatives, become the leader of a new initiative. That's certainly one thing that maybe engineers, who are eager to sort of grow beyond just, what they do as an IC might benefit from at a startup, right? You might go somewhere, it's very early, 4 or 5 people. They don't have a chief security officer, but then they start signing up enterprise clients and they sure are going to need one. And so if you're the person who steps forward and raises your hand, that might be an opportunity for you to grow into some big shoes.
Yeah, I know I've spoken to a number of people on, my privacy and security engineering podcast, Partially Redacted, where you hear about a lot of the engineers that sort of find their way into privacy. And a lot of times it is that experience. It's like, well, I was working for a company, we were starting to deal with like highly sensitive data, regulated data, and we had nobody to own this. And I was like, kind of raised my hand and got interested in it and found out that I really love it. And then they essentially crafted that career in privacy. That's harder switch, I think, to do in big tech. And I think, there's of course value in both types of experiences, but they are very different. Like, from my experience at Google and also working with a lot of young engineers that have moved from college into those careers, like one of the big things is from an infrastructure standpoint, like those problems are solved. Like you're basically turning knobs that someone like already figured out a decade ago.
Right.
Like, oh, I need this much scale. Okay, let's tweak this parameter, and it's there you go. And your focus is generally more narrow as well, because you just have more resources, more people, and they've kind of like figured out a lot of this stuff. So you can have really specific, essentially, job role, and there's less sort of ambiguity with what you're doing. And I think you also have a better support system. Like used to nurturing talent. They could take somebody who's, 22 years old, straight from their computer science undergrad, and invest a couple of years in turning that person into a great engineer. It's harder to do that at a startup when you're under the pressure of getting product market fit, figuring out your go to market, generating revenue, raising that next round. It's hard to say, I'm going to put 2 years of investment into this person and turn them into a great engineer. But at the same time, there's this trade-off of, like, as you mentioned, less growth opportunity. Like, it's harder to step outside your swim lane and say, I'm going to take on this new problem or new challenge. And because essentially there's no one else to do that, or it looks interesting to me and I'm excited about it.
I like the way you frame it. I think, there are opportunities to learn at both, but maybe they're a little bit different. At the startup, it's often way more self-directed, or, it's in the interaction with your team trying to solve, like you said, big problems of, we don't really have infrastructure, if this thing takes off and gets 1 million downloads, or, we've never dealt with enterprise level security questions from a customer before. So you're learning, sort of with your peers, maybe less a mentor, and I'm sure it could happen. Whereas at a large organization, some of them almost have a curriculum when you come in. You're not going to touch any production code for the first 6 or 10 months. There's a track here essentially that's going to get you up to speed on what it would be like to be an engineer who contributes here. And I'm sure a lot of that would, apply across a number of big FANG companies, right? If you get that training once, you'd probably be able to more easily fit into a role at a large corporation like that. And then to your point, there are probably more people who are in the role of mentor at those big places who have been there 5, 10, 15 years and, maybe enjoy the cushier role of middle management and guiding young folks through and, not themselves being day in, day out trying to build something specifically on the product side.
Yeah. I mean, if you're an intern for summer at Google as an engineer, you're going to end up most likely working on some sort of toy problem.
Yeah.
You're not going to be contributing to production code. Like, it's just like the ramp up time is too long for you to get there. So they have to give you something smaller that's probably never going to see the light of day.
Right.
Versus a startup, there's no difference essentially between the intern contributions and like anybody else as a full-time employee, because like, if you're not adding value, then, kind of why you're here at this point.
Right. I mean, I'd like to know what you think. I think some of it comes down to personality. Like, we both have kids. I think of myself as being a little bit maybe risk averse. I was never the person who dropped out of college because I had an idea and decided to found something and slept on a couch. That wasn't me. But, there's risks to both sides, right? At a startup, the risk is a little bit more maybe financial. You're taking a flyer on a lower wage to get shares, which I know you want to talk about later, to get equity in the company that may end up being worthless, right? Maybe your healthcare is not as good, but your ability to contribute and probably to be involved in whatever is getting built is pretty high. Whereas at some of these large tech companies, you may be assigned to a certain product or initiative, but it may get built internally and never see the light of day, or get built but just not get traction that is up to the global scale they were looking for, and so it just gets sunset. So you may end up doing a lot of work and then feeling sort of unsatisfied that it didn't really lead anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's just from my own, going back to my own experience at Google, like there's a lot of Google products that are, dead somewhere because the bar for success is very, very high. They have essentially $100 billion ads business. And if it's not something like, it takes a lot of money to make any kind of dent in that. Whereas in a startup, every single like dollar that you're collecting is impactful, especially in the early days.
And they can afford to take a flyer on a lot of experiments. You may think it's great because they're like, yeah, of course, go out and build it. Like, let's see what happens. But, it's, for them, it's not even a rounding error. So, it's not like they feel like they need to release it if it doesn't blow them away.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think from the risk perspective, at least, I might have, maybe I just have like a high risk tolerance. Like even when I was, founding my own company, I left a career basically in academics to do that. And I never really felt the pressure of the risk, I guess, because I felt like I had a skill set that even if this doesn't work out, I could always go and find something, right? Like, of course I want to work hard and make it successful, but I always felt like, I'm going to have an opportunity to make money. Those jobs are always sort of available.
Yeah.
So it was worth like potentially putting some time into this, where I am, especially as a founder, in the early days, making significantly less than, market rate. But even from a startup perspective, I think now the the amount of investment the startups are getting is much higher than it was back when, I was doing my company. Like back
Right.
then, a seed round was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now you're seeing pre-seed
Right.
rounds of like $50 million.
Right.
So I think people are paying more close to like market rate in terms of salaries. But the trade-off is that you can't essentially cash in options until there's some sort of liquidation event. So there is, of course, I think it's like you're not quite at the stage where you need to be sleeping on your buddy's couch and you're all living
Right.
in a house, unless you're like maybe the first, founding engineer and the company hasn't raised any money. But
Yeah.
I think even for companies that are, in the Series A, B, C range, you can still get a lot of the value of being a startup engineer with the potential growth, the excitement of of all the scale and the new challenges and problems without necessarily, living on top ramen and
Yeah.
and not being able to save anything for the future.
Right. Exactly. I mean, as someone who is formerly a journalist and worked in digital media, I don't think I felt the same way, right? Like I do think one nice thing, if you're able to educate yourself in the world of computer science and software development, is you can always say, well, I might lose this job, but, there's always more demand than supply when it comes to talented engineers. And so, I'll find my way to something next. I wonder if that's true right now. Like I do know that, for the last year across the big tech companies, there were layoffs and hiring freezes. And maybe for the first time in a long time, it wouldn't have been as easy to make that argument to say like, look, you're going to get laid off today, but there'll be 100 recruiters in your LinkedIn inbox and you'll get picked up somewhere tomorrow. Maybe you could find something, but it might not be commensurate with the salary or, seniority that you had before. And I don't know if that's a blip or if that, like I said, is going to continue. Like I think a lot of that has to do with big macro factors like inflation, that don't really necessarily have to do with the world of technology. But yeah, I think like definitely from my perspective of that last 10 years, it was like software engineers can afford to take risks, right? That's one of the nice things about the career is that, in the end, if it doesn't work out, there's every company needs software engineers. A supermarket, a car company, an airline, everybody's going to need a great software engineer in the end. I wonder to what degree that's still true.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's sort of normal, economic things where you have these growth cycles and then you essentially have the contraction. You had that, even going back over 20 years ago to the dot-com boom and then the
Right.
dot-com bust, but they cycle around again. Even if you look
Yeah.
at, I think the last year and a half where we've had a crunch in the market and a reduction of valuations. Now, all of a sudden though, there's the Gen AI LLM world that's like blowing up that those companies are getting essentially valued at those 2021 valuations. Like the rules don't apply to those companies all of a sudden. So it's almost like the contraction happened, but it was I don't know. I haven't looked at the full spectrum of things, but it feels like the expansion's happening again already, even though it's only been, maybe 12 months.
You have to be the kind of, resume Jedi who can move from mobile to VR to Web3 to AI and always, be extremely qualified for whatever hype cycle we're in, and some people are very good at making those transitions. So more power to them.
That's one of the values though of, I think, having that startup experience is you are able to essentially have more opportunities to kind of skill stack. So you become more adaptable. And I think, actually that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, what are sort of the qualities or skills that you think make someone successful and thrive in a startup environment versus big tech? Because it's not for everybody.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I do think a certain amount of it is about initiative and where you feel comfortable. Some people feel more comfortable getting an assignment from a manager. This is what I want us to accomplish. And, we have sprints and story points. And when you get to the end of that, somebody will tell you, hey, I think you did a great job. And that's a pat on the head and it feels good. And, maybe it comes with some other rewards. Whereas when you're at a startup, you may, try 2 or 3 or 4 things that go nowhere, and you're trying them based on the ideas that you and a few other team members have come up with. And that can be very, harrowing, like to think like, are we going to figure this out? Are we going to get the product market fit? Are we finally going to get traction? Are we going to get noticed in the press? So, I think for people who prefer to kind of blaze their own trail, a little bit and are a little bit, more comfortable with taking the initiative, the startup role is more for them. I guess the other thing I would say is like, my experience inside of startups, and you'd have to let me know compared to big companies, is that like we said, getting things done, right? GSD is what matters in the end, and is probably going to be very visible and hard to miss. And that was definitely true at DJI. They really encourage people within the engineering department to come up with prototypes, to like spend time at internal hackathons and, see if they could bring to the attention of the executives something that might be the next big gadget, right? Like that was encouraged. DJI, I don't know if you would call it a startup. It had a ton of employees, but that was certainly the culture there. And that's very different from, I'm assigned to a product that's inside of a portfolio that, generates billions of dollars. And we might incrementally move the needle by changing this part of the camera function, And so, I think, like succeeding in some of those bigger places is maybe as much about your political and social skill as it is about your technical talent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case, at least in my experience, is that
Yeah.
as you level up, a lot of your job starts to become thinking about, how do I essentially gain visibility for my projects to prove the impact that I have.
Yeah.
But when you're at 100-person organization, if you're impactful, everybody knows it. Like there's nowhere to hide. And if you're not impactful,
Right.
there's a negative consequence of that where there's basically nowhere to hide. So people are going to know. But the advantage there is that your projects can have legitimate company level impact. And it's not, you could focus kind of on the work rather than selling your work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. We had Kat Hicks from Pluralsight on the podcast, I think it was like last week, and they had done a survey with developers about, what makes people feel like they're thriving at work. And one of the big things that engineers brought up was recognition and agency. And that for a lot of folks, especially in larger companies, they didn't feel like the work they did really got noticed. And that might have been because it was the research work that went in ahead of time, or it was, the testing that went in before production, or it was some code inside of a huge, product where there's not a list of, it's not like a video game where at the end, there's its titles, credits that say everybody who worked on every pixel, right? And so, that was something that really made the difference for sort of developer happiness and productivity. It was like, am I getting recognition for the work I'm doing? And so, I think there's a big difference between a big company and a small company when it comes to that. I guess maybe another thing to say about that is that's why open source is so appealing to everyone, right? Like you can go and make a little change in the point out a typo in the documentation, and now you're part of this big project and it shows up on your GitHub, and, you can put that on your CV. And as you grow more and more in the open source world, it's up to you to determine how visible you are. And so I think that's one of the things that maybe draws developers to that, that ecosystem.
Yeah. And I think the same thing in many ways that draws people, I think, to open source is what draws people to working at startups too, because it's more sort of, passion driven or mission driven.
Yeah.
Like unless it's your day job to contribute to open source, like you're doing it because you're interested in it or because it's something that brings you like personal satisfaction. And, joining a, 10-person or 50-person or 100-person startup, you're making a choice to sort of buy into the vision of that company. And that's a great thing if you believe in it, because it's fun to be part of a system where everybody feels passionate about it. Where in the world of, I think, like the FAANG companies or big tech, like sure, some people are there because they, believe in the vision, but there's people there for lots of different reasons, and that's okay. But they're not necessarily there because it's like, oh, I love the, vision of organizing the world's information in the context of Google, but like they're there because they like the prestige or the benefits or the work-life balance. And that's totally fine, but it's just a completely different beast than, joining a small organization.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess like one of the things that, I think about when we talk about like, what is it that, inspires you as an engineer? The mentality right now, I don't think, as you pointed out, is where it was in the .com days or where it was maybe in part of the Web3 days, where you felt like I could land somewhere and within a few years, like I might be on a rocket ship, like I might have a lottery ticket. Even with these AI startups, I feel like maybe you think I'm going to be really well compensated and contribute, in a meaningful way to some technology that's going to be amazing. But I think right now, at least, people realize that there's no like quick win. I don't think that's the way the tech ecosystem appears right now. And maybe that's a good thing, like you said, to have those cycles and for that to be the cycle that we're in right now.
Yeah. And I think if you're joining a startup because you're hoping for like the payday and that's like your main motivating factor, there's much easier ways to make,
you could go to Vegas
to make money. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I'm still holding on to some paper options, that I bought from my former employers in the world of digital media. And it's been 5 years and they're worth less than, what I paid for them then. So, I'm not hopeful. And, I know you wanted to talk about some of that stuff, like RSUs and, startup equity. I mean, I do think that it's very difficult to get to the liquidity event. Like you see the wins, it's the confirmation bias. You see the wins, they get touted in, all the, the press and, you hear about people who go from there onto the next big thing. But most startup equity, goes basically to zero. Because even if, and this is an important point, even if the company gets acquired, there's a preference stack of investors and, maybe executives who will get paid out, before you do as just, somebody who works there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think though, the like one thing that's important to understand, and we can get into the specifics of some of the stuff around options and RSUs, but there is also like the intangible values that you get from being part of a successful startup, even if you don't necessarily get that big like paycheck at the end of the day. If you're part of a company that goes public, even if you're there really late, it's a credibility factor.
Totally.
And people are going to look at sort of the pedigree of your resume to evaluate how well they, how great they think you are. And, that fair or unfair, that's kind of how the world works to some degree. So, and then the other thing is there's also a lot from an education standpoint that you get, like we've been talking about. You have this chance to like skill stack and make yourself more adaptable. When it comes to, someone thinking about moving into the world of startups, whether that's from college or moving from big tech into startups, like how do you think they should be thinking about, how do I evaluate the options I have? How do I know whether this company is a good company to be a part of, even beyond just like thinking about the potential financials of it, but how do they evaluate the experience?
Right. I mean, I guess one thing I would say is that, you never know, if you're going to make the right bet and your startup is going to be the winner or not. So what's most important really is transparency. And I've worked at, a few different places. And one of the things that I think is super commendable about Stack Overflow is the level of transparency employees have, into the business and its goals and its targets and its results. And, that I think gives you at least a clear sense of where you're at so you can make educated decisions, on a looking out, 6 months or a year, like, is this still where I want to be? Do I want to commit and why? I think if you don't have that transparency, or if you feel like the startup you're at, is playing games with its numbers, or, if what they're saying in public doesn't match up to what you're seeing in private, that's a big red flag that I think people should use to probably say like, I may not know where this is going to end, but, chances are that, I'm not going to have the sort of, fair warning I need to make a good decision for myself. Right.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Like I think, and there's lots of ways of testing that during the interview process. Like you can ask about, if they've raised money, what was their last valuation? If they give you an options package, you can ask for, what does that mean in terms of what the value of the company today and so forth. And if they are cagey about that, I think those are red flags. I think some of the other things that are useful to look at too is, team quality. Like what is sort of the backgrounds of the founders? Like what is their story? Have they had, is this the first time they're doing this or is this, the second or third time? And if they've only done it the first time, like what did they do before? And what gives you a sense for that these are the right people to solve this problem? Just like someone who's investing in a company financially is going to look at those types of things. You should be looking at that, especially in the early stages. It's really hard, I think, to judge, what it's going to be like to work at these companies when they're early because you just don't have that much information to go on. So you probably don't know somebody necessarily that works there. So there's some risk associated with that, but there are ways to kind of, just like they're going to do background checks on you and reference checks, you should be doing that on them as well. It goes both ways.
Yeah, one trend that I think is interesting in the world of software engineering is the idea that if you, get into the later stage of potentially working at a company, they might pull you in and say, for a week, you're going to work with us on this project. Like we're trying to get from A to B this week. And, we're going to share, this repo with you and you're allowed to, throw in some PRs or like see how we work. And that I think can be super valuable. Some companies even, which is great, would pay people for that. Like Paul Ford used to be on the podcast with me, and at Postlight, they would say, we want you basically to come in and work as if you worked here for a week, and we're going to pay you for your time. And after that, both of us, both the employee and the employer, will have a chance to sort of say, like, I think this is a good fit, right?
Yeah, it's like staging at a restaurant, essentially. Yeah, I mean, it makes a ton of sense. And I think another way to look at it too, and I always guide this with people who are hiring, and especially hiring for the first time, is like when you're evaluating a candidate, essentially, it's never probably going to be better than the phase that you're interviewing. Like, because essentially the candidate is performing for you. They're trying to put their best foot forward. That goes the same way for the company. So if your experience interviewing with the company is like not that great, well, they're like performing for you at this point. They're trying to essentially recruit you. They're trying to do the best job. So if that experience is not great, it's probably not going to get a whole lot better if you do actually join.
Right. I mean, yeah, a lot of people now spend a lot of time doing essentially practice tests that they think are going to show up on the technical challenges in the technical interview, right? So, and that's another reason why it might be good to actually have somebody kind of work with you on your own project, try to figure things out in your own code base, because people, like you said, are putting their best foot forward after having, spent, 3, 4, 5 weeks on the leak code, trying to see if they can, get themselves in shape to ace that technical interview.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think these are all like things that as a candidate, you need to be paying attention to. So we mentioned, the sort of the idea of, options and what those kind of mean in the context of a startup. So, I have lots of friends that went directly from college to big tech, and they're kind of used to this, getting a salary, getting a bonus, getting RSUs is kind of like all ways of essentially generating cash. And they don't really even understand how to think about an offer from a startup and what it means for them. So how should an engineer that's maybe moving from big tech with RSUs or even from college think about evaluating options?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think if you're going to a startup, you should, in your mind say, there's a good chance that these may be worthless or that they may be illiquid. Not worthless, but illiquid for a very long time. And so maybe you have built up a financial cushion after working at a big tech company, or maybe you're early in your career and you don't have a mortgage and a family to support, and so you're less concerned about that. I think it would probably be stressful, to go from a big tech company where you're getting, like you said, compensated in ways that are kind of transparent. You can look up the share price, every day and see what it's going to be like. And when the quarter's going to end and things are predictable, to a startup where, it's unpredictable when they may raise their next round and at what valuation, right? And so I think that's something you have to do eyes wide open. It's not, something that you can sort of just hand wave away. But there are a few things, like I said before, that I think you can do. And, if a place has been around for a while, you can ask folks if, during previous rounds, they let folks cash out a little bit. So some startups do try to give their employees some liquidity. Or, if it's a well-known startup, is there a secondary market for this, which is another thing that can happen where, you can have that option to move your shares there to other people who want to sort of take a bet on that company, or they want to get into the equity before it goes public. And so that would be a way for you, that would be a way, like you said, to basically take cash out, even if the company itself doesn't get acquired or go public.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to think about too is that there's, even within the world of startups, there's a huge variation in terms of what a startup really means. Like, it's very different from joining a company that's like less than 10 people and they don't even have a product versus, joining essentially a pre-IPO company where the IPO is like imminent and they're just waiting for the right time to come public.
Right.
So, and the options that you have available for liquidity and cashing out, like secondary markets and so forth, changes at the stage of the company. And I think it's a good thing to kind of map like where you are, what you want to get out of that journey and experience, and also what your comfort level is from like a financial perspective and risk perspective with where that company is in their journey.
Right. I'm not going to, I think both those things are true. I'm not going to name any names, but some companies have been have filed their papers and are waiting for their IPO window. And it's been years now, and it hasn't been the right time, or when it was the right time, their business was not in the right place, so, that is an unfortunate thing that can happen with startups. And obviously, I think, like you said, the flip side is I was employee 10 at company X, and everybody's heard of company X now. That's a huge, blue ribbon on your resume, and that's going to open a ton of doors for you, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think having those things on your resume, they get you basically an interview with any company in the world. Like, it might not land you the job, but it gets you sort of the goodwill to pass through, whatever black box system they're using for evaluating resumes. And it even gets to a point where people are like actively trying to recruit you rather than you having to go out and like source those opportunities.
Yeah.
So in terms of, a startup success, like, recruitment is a big challenge. What kind of strategies have you seen that are effective for companies to recruit and nurture talent and sort of maintain the culture of their company through like competitive cycles?
Yeah. I mean, I think that you probably have some thoughts on this because you've been in this world, but I think great DevRel is about getting, really talented people who have a passion for engineering and love building projects, but are also good up on stage and can give a demo or give a great talk, are great on social media and don't mind sharing their work and having a back and forth with folks. So I think that's probably one of the most effective ways is like an engineer sees another engineer that's built something cool that's, they can contribute to, or they see a talk that they feel like they learned from. That's going to build a lot of goodwill, towards the organization. I think that that's kind of what my job is inside of Stack Overflow, right? Like, make sure we have a great engineering blog, make sure we have great guests on the podcast, make sure the newsletter is interesting. And hopefully that will be entertaining and informative to developers most of the time. And every once in a while, they'll see that we're hiring, or they'll see we've launched a new product or something like that. And then one thing that has come to mind recently, I did an interview recently with someone who's on the Python Steering Council and works at Bloomberg as part of the podcast. And, he did not initially come in as a Python expert. He was a physicist, then he went to Bloomberg, then he started working more Python. And over time, like you said, just became his passion. He was essentially working two jobs. He got all the way to the steering council, and now he's helping guide the future of this major language. And so they essentially said at Bloomberg, you can take 50% of your hours and work on that. We're going to pay you to be partially internal and partially external to this open source organization. And that's a big draw. People want to go to work at Bloomberg knowing on day one, when the new version comes out, we're already going to know all about it and get, to play with it. Or, this is a place where the people who are guiding the future of this language that, is sort of my chosen one are working, and I can, give them ideas that might help shape it. So I think, that has been a very successful strategy for companies, and you can name some, your TypeScript, your React, your Go. I think that is a really interesting strategy to approach for a company to embrace open source and to encourage their, developers or engineers to work in that, so that they can, in that way, reach a really broad community of folks who might be interested in working at that company and show their technical acumen.
Yeah, I think, one of the things you touched on is on the developer relations side, but even for a business that isn't necessarily developer focused, the content, I think, plays a big factor in people's perception of your company. Like, we are a developer focused company at Skyflow, but we hear all the time from candidates that they, learned about the company through the content, or they got pinged by a recruiter and then they looked at some of the content, whether it was a video, a podcast, a blog post, or something like that. And then they basically, it felt good to them. They're like, oh, right, these are my people. So, I want to work here now.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think as you are able to recruit more great people, of course, like A players attract other A players, and they know people within their network that they can refer, which then becomes like an engine for your recruitment arm. And then I also think that having sort of everyone understand that there's a marketing component to recruitment and interviewing. You're representing your company when you're doing that. So even if a candidate is not the right fit, and maybe they're even a disaster in the interview, you want that person leaving feeling like they've been respected, that they had, that they, were given a fair chance, and they're excited about the company, even if that leads to a decision where they don't ultimately get the job.
Completely. I mean, if you go to our programming one day and you're reading a horror story thread about, a really bad interview where the people felt like, they were bullied or, they just weren't listened to, you're going to want to tune that company out if it gets, if it's called out and that kind of thing. So I think that's super important. And yeah, I mean, to your point about content, I think within a startup, it's maybe a little bit easier to sort of say like, this is exactly what we're working on and this is what we're all about. And if you care about these things, you should come here. At a big company, I think that's one of the reasons that they, may invest in that or, come work with Stack Overflow. We do sponsored podcasts and blogs is to say like, well, what's the developer experience really like inside this huge org? Like, can you tell us about a project that you worked on that, got, time from idea to production down from 30 days to, a couple of hours? And if somebody hears a story about an engineer solving a problem, that might give them perspective on what it's actually like to work inside that big organization versus kind of this, vague amorphous sense that it would be good to work at this place because it's well known and, about high technology.
Yeah, I think that there's something part of the interview process you should be looking. It's an opportunity for you to sort of test the people that are interviewing with you, whether you feel like this is a learning opportunity for you.
Right.
You don't necessarily want to come in thinking that like, oh, well, I need to teach these people because they have no idea what they're doing. Like that's probably not a good place to be.
Right.
Versus coming in and being like, oh, wow, I could really learn something here, especially if you're early in your career.
Yeah. And we've talked about this a few times on the podcast, but it can be really great. I know a lot of engineers get frustrated with the amount of recruiters in their inbox, but take interviews when you're at a point in your career where you don't want to leave the job or you don't need to leave the job just to practice that and interviewing the interviewer and turning things around where it's like, I don't need to feel any stress in this interview. I'm not going in here because I want this job. I'm going in here to like, just stay sharp in this mode, right? Like to be able to talk organically about what I would want at a company and, what would make me really happy there. And, that's different than like you said, well, I got to perform, I need this job. I have to put my best before I'm going to say what I think they want me to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, as we start to wrap things up, just kind of looking big picture, even outside of, career advice for people looking to move to startups. In the world of startups, what kind of, is there, a big problem that you would love to see a startup try to solve essentially? Like what is, some issue that you would love to see somebody, come up with a product that would ease your life or you'd be excited about?
I think the one that I was most interested in was tea.xyz, I think it's called Tea. It's from the creator of Homebrew. And the problem he was trying to solve essentially was how do you compensate the contributors and maintainers of open source projects? How do you make sure that the people who have built, this widget, which now is holding up 90% of the internet, as XKCD would tell us, don't get burnt out and leave that project, sort of flailing in the wind. So I thought that was a cool one. I think it combines, a little bit of blockchain, but not in a bad way, with the idea of supporting open source, which I think we can all get behind. And that has been, a problem that's been discussed in the 5 years I've been here a number of times on the podcast is like, what's the best way to have a healthy open source ecosystem? So I think if a startup thinks that's, the product they can build, that's a cool idea.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love it. Ben, thanks so much for being here. I think people are going to enjoy this. I know I enjoyed it. So, at the very least, I'm satisfied and happy. But
great.
Hopefully we're able to help someone out there that's kind of navigating the world of startups and understand, their opportunities that they have a little bit clearer. So thanks so much for being here and cheers.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it and I enjoyed the conversation.